Hello and welcome to topic 11, lecture 1. And in this topic, we're going to be learning about sentencing and punishment. So this chapter 11 that you're going to be reading for this week serves as a segue between the chapter you read last week on the courts and the chapter that we're going to be reading for the final chapter for the semester, which is corrections. And so that's because we're learning about sentencing this week, and sentencing takes place in the courts. It is the judge that determines the sentence. And so at the end of a trial, when a jury renders a verdict, then the judge is the one who sentenced the individual. As we know, most criminal charges do not end up in a trial, end up in a plea agreement instead. So when a person waives their trial rights and pleads guilty, it's still the judge that's going to determine the sentence. Now, as we will learn in this chapter, and as we learned from reading Locked In as well, that the sentence is oftentimes based on the recommendation that the prosecutor and the defense attorney makes, and is also a reflection of the sentencing guidelines from that state as well. Usually the jury doesn't play a role in sentencing, but they do in the death penalty, and we'll be talking about that in the next lecture, which is about the death penalty. So that's what takes place in the courts, but it is the correctional agencies that carry out the punishment, okay? And so if you are sentenced to some sort of probation, a diversion, like where you engage in some community activity or get rehab, and then the charges would be dropped, or some sort of in-community-based corrections or in-home corrections. If you're sentenced to that, then it will be the correctional agencies that will implement that sentence. There's a chapter that's dedicated to that in your textbook. We're not going to be doing that chapter, but you can read it if you're interested. Next week, we're going to focus on the correctional institutions, jails and prisons, where sentences of incarceration are implemented. The correctional agencies can impact the length of a sentence. So, if you have good behavior while in jail or prison, you might get out earlier. The correctional agencies are oftentimes charged with determining parole, early release. Correctional agencies play a role in the length of sentence, although they don't determine the sentence. So what are we going to be doing in this lecture? Well, in this lecture, we're going to learn about the goals of punishment. We're going to be looking at sentencing models, and then we're also going to talk about factors that impact sentencing. In the next lecture, we're going to be focusing solely on the death penalty. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about in the lecture is the goals of punishment. And to get us thinking about the goals of punishment, I want to have you think about this example. So as you might recall, a couple of years ago, on December 23rd, 2021, Kim Porter, a police officer from the Minnesota area, was found guilty of manslaughter for the unintentional killing of Daunte Wright. So Kim Porter's at the top of the slide there, and Daunte Wright is in the bottom. And as you might recall, that she went to trial and she claimed that the shooting death of Daunte Wright was accidental. She said that she meant to tase him, not to kill him, and that she accidentally grabbed for her gun when she meant to grab for the taser. The jury did not buy that argument, and they did find her guilty of manslaughter, as is stated there. So the question is what is the appropriate punishment for her action? Okay. So she's a police officer. She had been on the force for a long period of time. She claims that this was a really bad accident. She expressed some remorse. And so what should be her punishment? Should she be put on probation? This is her first offense. Should she be incarcerated? Home confinement? So what would be the appropriate punishment for her actions? And also that when you think about what the appropriate punishment for her actions should be, like what are we thinking the goals of that punishment would be? Is one of the goals to set an example for other cops And so that if you basically say, look, we want to punish her in a way that's going to send a message to other cops that they should be very careful about whether they're using their gun or their taser, you might want to give her a pretty stiff punishment, a punishment of incarceration. That do we want to make her suffer from the harm that she's done to Dante Wright and his family? That if that's the case, then again, she would probably get a pretty significant sentence. Is she a threat to society? Okay. I mean, so it's one of the goals of what the punishment she should receive is that she shouldn't be out on the streets, that she's dangerous, that she needs to be in confinement. Okay. So keep that in mind. And at the end of the lecture, we'll look at the actual sentence that she received. And in fact, she just recently, I think today, was released from prison. And so keep that in mind as we are learning about the goals of punishment. So your textbook identifies 6 goals of punishment. We'll go over each of these briefly and use an example to bring it to life. So we have general deterrence, incapacitation, specific deterrence, retribution / just desserts, equity restitution, rehabilitation, and diversion. Okay, so those are the 6 that your textbook looks like it's 7 that your textbook points to. So let's take a look at each of these individually. Okay, so the first 2 goals of punishment that we're going to talk about are concepts that you're already familiar with. That you're familiar with general deterrence and specific deterrence because we learned about it earlier in the semester when we were learning about the crime control perspective. So to refresh your memory, general deterrence is that you want to discourage an action by instilling fear, okay? So remember back to James Q. Wilson, he was like, the vast majority of us are sort of sitting around waiting and watching to see how criminals are treated, what kind of punishment that they get. And if they get a really harsh punishment, then those who are thinking about committing the crime are not going to commit the crime. And so the goal of general deterrence is that people should be punished harshly in order to set an example for others. So let's say that in sentencing Kim Potter, that the sentencing judge gives her a very long sentence. According to a Minnesota state law, that for the first degree manslaughter that she was found guilty for, that she could get a sentence of up to 7 years, and the judge can always go higher than that. And so if you were to sentence Potter to 7 years, that maybe the goal of that is because you want to send a message to other cops to be more attentive when they are doing their jobs. And if they don't, then you're really going to get in trouble for it. On the flip side, that the goal of punishment could be specific deterrence. And specific deterrence is that you want the personal experience of suffering the punishment to be so bad that it inhibits future law violations for the offender, right? So in other words, that if you are going to give Potter a harsh punishment for her unintentional killing of Dante Wright, that you'd give her a harsh punishment because you wouldn't want her to repeat this kind of behavior once she gets back into society. Now, probably the goal for Kim Potter is not going to be specific deterrence because she will never be law enforcement again, right? And so she wouldn't be able to repeat this kind of offense, although I think maybe it could encourage her not to engage in negligent behavior in the future, although she really hadn't engaged in that kind of negligent behavior in the past. But still, specific deterrence as a goal of punishment is basically making the punishment harsh so that the offender does not reoffend. Another goal of punishment is incapacitation, okay? And the thinking here is that the criminal, the person who committed this crime, is so dangerous that they must be removed from society. Okay, so the goal is to incapacitate them, to get them out of society so that they can no longer continue to harm other people. And so the goal is preventing crime by keeping offenders under state control. Probably the goal that the sentencing judge in Kim Potter's case considered, it was a female judge, she didn't probably not think about incapacitation, that because this was a first offense for Kim Potter, she's unlikely to engage in this behavior again. She probably doesn't pose a danger to society. However, when you think about Darrell Brooks, remember the guy who drove his car into the Waukesha Christmas parade, killing and injuring many people. It could very well be that if he, is, either pleads guilty or is found guilty in a trial, that's likely going to be a goal for his sentencing. He's a multiple offender, and that he seems to be erratic and unable to, control his behavior. So incapacitation might very well be a goal for the sentence. And for some offenses, incapacitation makes a lot of sense, particularly for the most violent offenders and for repeat violent offenders as well. But as we know from reading in Locked In, that incapacitation does definitely have some consequences. That the consequence of being removed from society is costly. It's costly both in terms of the amount of money that it takes to keep somebody behind bars, but it's also costly because of the social impact that has on the offender and on the community and the family as well. We also learned in Locked Out that many people age out of violent crime. So giving a long incapacitation sentence, giving somebody a long sentence of incarceration in order to keep them incapacitated, keep them away from harming people, that might not make a lot of sense, because maybe in the first 10 years that makes sense, but let's say you get a 30-year sentence, you're not likely to pose you're not as likely to pose harm to society because you basically aged out of that violent crime moment. So that in other words, that you're not a threat, although you still may remain incapacitated. Okay, so incapacitation as a goal of punishment. Okay, let's look at the goal of punishment that's known as retribution or just desserts. And basically, when you give somebody a punishment and the goal of that punishment is retribution, basically you're saying that the goal of this punishment is that you are getting punished simply because you deserve to be disciplined for what you did. The goal isn't to incapacitate you, to keep you because we think you're harmful. The goal isn't to send a message to others. It's just basically saying, you did something really wrong and you deserve to get a harsh punishment because you did something bad. In other words, you get what you deserve, and that it would maybe be proportional, right? I mean, that oftentimes that just desserts, and that's why it's called just desserts, because you get what you deserve. Oftentimes people think that use just desserts or retribution as a justification for the death penalty, sort of an eye for an eye, that if you take somebody's life in an intentionally horrible way, that you are going to yourself die in an intentionally horrible way, right? I guess you could say lethal injection is not horrible, but I mean, you're waiting and waiting and waiting. I mean, other forms of the death penalty, hanging and those sorts of things were probably pretty, or electrocution were probably pretty gruesome. But the bottom line is that oftentimes the death penalty is justified because you killed, you're going to get killed. And you're going to see, we're watching this great movie this week called Dead Man Walking, about it's a dramatization of somebody who is waiting on death row to be executed. And you're going to see that the victims of Matthew Poncelet, the main character in the movie, his victims' parents, they say he should get the death penalty because he gets what he deserves. How does just desserts relate to Kim Potter? What does she deserve in terms of her punishment? And so, as a sentencing judge, let's say that the goal of the punishment towards Kim Potter was she gets what she deserves. Well, the question is what does she deserve? Is she to blame? I mean, it really, she said it was accidental. She never intended to get the gun. She thought she had the taser. It was a tragic accident. And so what is just dessert for her? Well, from Dante Wright's family's perspective, they probably feel that, yeah, she does deserve a harsh punishment. because that's what she deserved, because she took the life of their family member. Okay, and so you could see that just you get what you deserve sometimes comes into play when it comes to the goals of punishment. Another goal of punishment is equity or restitution. In other words, that you pay for the harm that you perpetrated through your criminal act. And so the goal of punishing somebody because you want or seeking restitution or equity is that the criminal must pay back their victim for their losses, or the criminal justice system and society for the costs associated with the case. And a good example of that is in 2020, Purdue Pharma pled guilty to criminal charges as it relates to the production. Purdue Pharma is responsible for producing Oxycontin, which led to, they lied about the addictiveness nature of the drug, and it led to a lot of drug overdoses and drug abuse that resulted in death. And so they pled guilty to criminal charges, and that they were their penalty, their sentence, was to pay $4 billion in criminal fines, with the hope of that money going to helping communities that have been harmed by the opioid crisis. So that's kind of a good example of retribution, that forcing Purdue Pharma to pay back to communities the harm that they did with lying about the addictive levels of their drug. Rehabilitation is also a goal of punishment. The goal of that is that the justice system is obliged to treat the sick, unfortunate people, not simply punish them for their misdeeds. So again, rehabilitation relates back to the rehabilitation perspective that we learned earlier in the semester, and that people who commit crimes, there's something wrong with them and that they need treatment. And so rehabilitation can be, as a goal of punishment, can be associated with the giving people the treatment that they need to get better so that they can join society again. A good example of that is Anissa Weir from the Sunderman case. She was one of the girls who was found not guilty due to reasons of mental disease or defect, but she was placed in a mental health facility until she got better. So in a way that, the state was rehabilitating her. They sentenced her to confinement at a mental health hospital until treated, and then she actually was treated and recently released back into society. But it's a good example of that being a goal of the punishment a person could receive. The last goal of punishment is diversion. And the goal of diversion, giving somebody a sentence, the goal that you want to achieve is that you want to spare a non-dangerous offender from the stigma and labeling of a criminal conviction and further involvement with the justice process. And so, for example, let's say that somebody is charged and pleads guilty to, drug possession. And that as a part of the agreement with the prosecutor, that the judge basically said, here's your sentence. You are sentenced to drug counseling and also community service, maybe, giving lectures to younger people about the consequences of drug use and how it harms your life. And then when you complete those requirements, then the charges will be dismissed, and also the pleading of guilty will just be erased from your record. Okay, kind of, sparing that nonviolent offender from the stigmas associated with a criminal conviction. Okay, and so that can be the goal of a punishment as well. That you want there to be some kind of punishment, but that the punishment is going to be of the non-incarcerated kind of capacity, whether it's at home confinement or, counseling and rehab. And then if you do these things and meet these goals, then those things will just basically be erased from your record.